Sarah Mitchell adjusted her emerald green dress one last time as she stared at herself in the bedroom mirror. The satin fabric caught the light perfectly, and the silver earrings her grandmother had given her sparkled against her dark hair. Tonight was supposed to be the night she and her friends had dreamed about since freshman year, prom night 1998 at Jefferson High School in the small town of Millbrook, Pennsylvania. "You look beautiful, honey," her mother said from the doorway, holding a camera. "David is so lucky to have you as his date." Sarah smiled, but something felt different tonight. Maybe it was the strange phone call she'd received that morning. A voice she didn't recognize had whispered, "Don't go tonight. Something terrible is going to happen." She'd hung up immediately, thinking it was just a prank, but the words kept echoing in her mind. Across town, David Rodriguez was having his own moment of doubt. He'd been looking forward to prom for months, especially since Sarah had agreed to be his date. They'd been friends since middle school, and he'd harbored feelings for her that went far deeper than friendship. Tonight felt like the perfect opportunity to tell her how he really felt. His younger sister, Maria, knocked on his bedroom door. "Mom wants to take pictures before you leave," she called out. David straightened his black tuxedo and checked his watch, 6:30. Sarah expected him to pick her up at 7, and he never liked to be late. The third member of their group, Jessica Chen, was already at her boyfriend Mark's house. Jessica had been Sarah's best friend since elementary school, and the four of them had planned to go to prom together. Mark Thompson was the star quarterback, popular and charming, but Jessica sometimes wondered if there was more to him than his perfect smile and athletic achievements. "Are you excited?" Mark asked as he pinned the corsage to her wrist. The white roses matched her cream-colored dress perfectly. "Of course," Jessica replied, though she noticed Mark seemed nervous. His hands were shaking slightly, and he kept checking his phone. "Everything okay?" "Yeah, I just want everything to be perfect tonight," he said, but his eyes didn't meet hers. By 7:15, all four friends were gathered at Sarah's house for the traditional pre-prom photos. Sarah's parents, along with David's mother and Jessica's family, snapped dozens of pictures. The teenagers laughed and posed, looking like the perfect group of friends ready for the night of their lives. "Make sure you're home by midnight," Sarah's father called out as they headed to David's car, a borrowed sedan from his uncle. "And drive carefully." "We will, Mr. Mitchell," David promised, opening the car door for Sarah. The prom was being held at the Millbrook Community Center, a modest venue decorated with silver and blue streamers and twinkling lights. The theme was Starry Night, and the decorating committee had done their best to transform the simple hall into something magical. For the first few hours, everything seemed perfect. Sarah and David danced to slow songs. Jessica and Mark won the award for Best Dressed Couple, and their group of friends took countless photos at the makeshift photo booth. Sarah began to forget about the strange phone call from that morning, but as the evening progressed, Mark became increasingly agitated. He kept checking his watch and whispering to someone on his phone when he thought no one was looking. Jessica noticed his behavior but didn't want to cause a scene at prom. "I need some fresh air," Mark announced around 10:30. "Anyone want to come outside?" The four friends walked out to the parking lot behind the community center. The May night was warm and other couples had scattered around the area, talking and laughing. Mark led them toward a more secluded area near the edge of the parking lot, where a line of pine trees created a natural barrier. "I have a surprise," Mark said, reaching into his tuxedo jacket. He pulled out a small flask. "I thought we could celebrate properly." David shook his head immediately. "Man, I'm driving. I can't drink." "Just a little," Mark insisted. "It's prom night. We're supposed to do crazy things we'll remember forever." Sarah felt uneasy again. Something about Mark's insistence didn't feel right. "I don't think this is a good idea," she said. "Come on, Sarah." Mark's voice had an edge to it now. "Don't be such a goody-goody." Jessica looked between her boyfriend and her friends, torn. She'd never seen Mark like this before, and it frightened her. That's when they heard the sound of car engines approaching. Not just one car, but several. Mark's expression changed from pushy to genuinely worried. "We need to go," he said quickly. "Now." "What's going on?" David demanded. 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Men in dark clothing got out of the vehicles, and even from a distance, the 4 teenagers could see they weren't from around Millbrook. "Mark, what did you do?" Jessica whispered. Mark grabbed her hand roughly. "I'll explain later. Right now we need to run." But it was too late. The men had spotted them and were walking quickly in their direction. Sarah could see that some of them were carrying something in their hands, though the darkness made it impossible to tell what. "Into the trees," David commanded, taking charge of the situation. He grabbed Sarah's hand, and the 4 of them ran toward the pine forest that bordered the community center property. Behind them, they could hear shouting and the sound of heavy footsteps following. Sarah's high heels made running difficult, so she kicked them off, feeling the pine needles and small stones cutting into her feet through her thin pantyhose. They ran deeper into the woods, branches catching at their formal clothes. Jessica's dress tore on a low branch, and David's tuxedo jacket got snagged and pulled off his shoulders. But they kept running, driven by a fear they didn't fully understand. After what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, they stopped to catch their breath in a small clearing. They could no longer hear their pursuers, but that didn't make them feel any safer. "Mark, you need to tell us what's happening," Sarah demanded, her voice shaking. Mark looked at his 3 friends, their once perfect prom attire now torn and dirty, and realized there was no going back. Whatever he'd gotten involved in had now pulled them all in too. "I borrowed some money," he admitted quietly. "A lot of money, and I can't pay it back." That was the last coherent conversation the 4 friends would have for a very long time. The next morning, Millbrook woke up to a nightmare. 4 of Jefferson High School's most promising students had vanished without a trace. David's uncle's car was found in the community center parking lot, keys still in the ignition, but there was no sign of the teenagers anywhere. Sarah's mother, Linda Mitchell, was the first to sound the alarm. When Sarah hadn't returned home by her midnight curfew, Linda had assumed she was just running late. By 1 in the morning, she was worried. By 2, she was calling David's house. When David's mother confirmed that he hadn't come home either, both families began to panic. The police arrived at the Mitchell household at 3:30 in the morning. Officer Robert Hayes, a 20-year veteran of the Millbrook Police Department, had never dealt with anything more serious than vandalism and the occasional drunk and disorderly incident. 4 missing teenagers was completely outside his experience. "When did you last see your daughter?" Officer Hayes asked Linda Mitchell, who was still wearing her bathrobe and clutching a cup of coffee with shaking hands. "Around 7:15 last night," Linda replied. "They left for prom in David's car. They all looked so happy." Her voice broke on the last word. By dawn, the entire town was in chaos. News of the missing teenagers spread quickly through Millbrook's tight-knit community. The high school principal, Dr. Elizabeth Warren, arrived at the police station before 6 in the morning, demanding to know what was being done to find her students. "We need to organize search parties," she told Officer Hayes. "These kids don't just disappear. Something happened to them." The initial investigation focused on the community center and the surrounding area. Police found Sarah's discarded high heels near the edge of the parking lot, along with what appeared to be David's tuxedo jacket hanging from a pine branch about 50 yards into the woods. But the trail went cold after that. Detective Maria Santos, from the county sheriff's department, was called in to assist with the case. She was the experienced investigator who had worked missing persons cases before, but something about this situation felt different from the start. "Tell me about these kids," she said to Dr. Warren, as they stood in the high school hallway surrounded by prom photos and banners. "Any problems? Drugs? Enemies?" "Absolutely not," Dr. Warren replied firmly. "Sarah Mitchell is valedictorian. David Rodriguez has a full scholarship to Penn State. Jessica Chen was accepted to 3 different nursing programs. And Mark Thompson, well, he's had some academic struggles, but nothing that would lead to this." Detective Santos made a note to look more closely into Mark Thompson's background. The search efforts intensified over the next few days. Volunteers from the community, along with professional search and rescue teams, combed through hundreds of acres of forest surrounding Millbrook. They used trained dogs, helicopters, and even brought in thermal imaging equipment, but found nothing beyond the shoes and jacket discovered on the first day. The families held a press conference on the third day after the disappearance. Linda Mitchell stood at a podium outside the police station, flanked by the other parents. Her eyes red from crying, but her voice steady with determination. "Our children are good kids," she said to the assembled reporters. They were excited about prom, about graduation, about their futures. They didn't run away. Someone took them from us, and we need your help to bring them home. David's mother, Carmen Rodriguez, spoke next. David was planning to ask Sarah to be his girlfriend that night, she revealed, her voice breaking. He'd been practicing what he was going to say for weeks. He wouldn't have just left without telling us. The media attention brought tips pouring in from across the state. People claimed to have seen the 4 teenagers at gas stations, restaurants, and hotels, hundreds of miles from Millbrook. Each lead was carefully investigated, but none led anywhere. Detective Santos focused her attention on the hours leading up to the disappearance. She interviewed dozens of students who had attended the prom, looking for any detail that might explain what had happened. "Mark seemed weird that night," admitted Amy Foster, a classmate who had been at prom. "He kept checking his phone and seemed really nervous. At one point, I saw him having what looked like an argument with someone on the phone." Another student, Brian Walsh, reported seeing unfamiliar men in the community center parking lot around 10 o'clock. "They weren't dressed for prom," he said. "They looked out of place. Older guys in dark clothes." Detective Santos requested the phone records for all 4 missing teenagers. What she found in Mark Thompson's records made her blood run cold. In the weeks leading up to prom, Mark had received dozens of calls from numbers associated with known criminal organizations in Philadelphia. She arranged to meet with Mark's parents privately. Robert and Helen Thompson sat in the detective's office looking exhausted and confused. "Did Mark ever mention owing money to anyone?" Detective Santos asked gently. Robert Thompson's face went pale. "He'd been asking for money lately," he admitted. "Said he needed it for college expenses. We gave him what we could, but it was never enough. He kept asking for more." "How much are we talking about?" the detective pressed. "Over the past 6 months? Maybe $5,000? Helen replied. "We thought it was for textbooks, applications, things like that." Detective Santos knew that $5,000 was nowhere near enough to pay off the kind of debt that would attract the attention of Philadelphia crime families. Mark had gotten in much deeper than his parents realized. The investigation took a darker turn when Detective Santos discovered that Mark had been involved in an illegal gambling operation run out of a pool hall in the next town over. According to her sources, Mark had been betting on college basketball games and had lost far more than he could afford to pay back. The kid was in for over $50,000, her informant told her. "That kind of money you don't just walk away from." 2 weeks after the disappearance, the first ransom demand arrived. It came in the form of a typed letter delivered to Sarah Mitchell's house. The message was simple and terrifying. "Your daughter and her friends are alive. $50,000 in unmarked bills will bring them home. Wait for further instructions." The families were torn between hope and despair. The letter proved the teenagers were alive, but it also confirmed their worst fears about what had happened. Detective Santos worked with federal agents to trace the letter, but it yielded no useful evidence. The paper was common office stock available at any store. The typewriter was an old model that could have belonged to anyone, and there were no fingerprints or DNA evidence. The second ransom letter arrived 5 days later, with more specific instructions. The money was to be left at a specific location on a back road 20 miles outside of town. The families, desperate to get their children back, decided to comply. But when Robert Thompson arrived at the designated spot with the money, no one came to collect it. He waited for hours in the rain, but the pickup never happened. That night, another letter arrived. "The police are involved. No deal. You will never see them again." That was the last communication the families ever received. Months passed, then a full year. The case remained open, But as Detective Santos was reassigned to other investigations and the media attention faded, the four missing teenagers began to seem like a tragic mystery that would never be solved. The families never stopped hoping, but as graduations came and went, as college acceptance letters arrived addressed to students who would never read them, the reality began to sink in. Sarah, David, Jessica, and Mark were gone, and no one knew if they would ever come home. 12 years had passed since that terrible prom night in 1998. Millbrook had tried to move on, but the disappearance of four teenagers had left a permanent scar on the small community. The families had aged visibly, carrying the weight of unanswered questions and endless grief. Linda Mitchell had turned her daughter's bedroom into a shrine of sorts. Sarah's prom dress still hung in the closet, and her college acceptance letters remained unopened on the desk. Every year on May 15th, the anniversary of the disappearance, Linda would sit in that room and talk to her daughter, as if she might walk through the door at any moment. Carmen Rodriguez had thrown herself into volunteer work, helping other families of missing persons. She'd become an advocate for better police procedures in missing person cases, traveling across the state to speak at conferences and training sessions. But late at night, she still waited by the phone, hoping to hear David's voice. The case had officially gone cold in 2003, filed away with hundreds of other unsolved mysteries. Detective Santos had retired, and the new investigators assigned to the case had little interest in revisiting old evidence. As far as the official record was concerned, Sarah Mitchell, David Rodriguez, Jessica Chen, and Mark Thompson had vanished into thin air on prom night 1998. That all changed on a bright October morning in 2010, when a construction crew working on a new housing development 30 miles from Millbrook made a discovery that would reopen the case and shock everyone involved. Jake Morrison was operating a backhoe, clearing trees for the foundation of what would become Sunset Ridge Estates. The land had been undeveloped forest for decades, thick with pine trees and undergrowth that made it nearly impossible to walk through. It was exactly the kind of remote location where someone might hide something they never wanted found. The backhoe's bucket struck something hard about 4 feet underground. Jake initially thought it was a large rock, but when he dug around it, he realized it was something man-made, something rectangular and metallic. "Hey, boss," Jake called out to his foreman, Mike Chen. "You better come look at this." Mike walked over and peered into the hole Jake had dug. What they were looking at appeared to be some kind of metal container, like a large toolbox or storage chest. It was covered in rust and dirt, but clearly had been buried deliberately. "Should we call the police?" Jake asked. Mike nodded grimly. He'd lived in the area his entire life, and he remembered the missing teenagers. Everyone who'd grown up around Millbrook remembered that case. Within an hour, the construction site was swarming with law enforcement. Detective Raymond Torres, who had taken over the cold case files, arrived with a team of forensic specialists. The metal container was carefully excavated and transported to the county crime lab. What they found inside would haunt everyone involved for years to come. The container held personal belongings that were immediately recognizable to anyone familiar with the case. Sarah's silver earrings, the ones her grandmother had given her. David's wallet, still containing his driver's license and $17 in cash. Jessica's class ring. Mark's watch, a graduation gift from his parents. But there was more. Much more. Wrapped in plastic bags were documents that told a story no one had expected. Bank statements showing large cash deposits into accounts belonging to people connected to Philadelphia organized crime families. Photographs of Mark Thompson, meeting with men the FBI had been investigating for years. And most shocking of all, a handwritten journal in Mark's distinctive writing that detailed his involvement in a money laundering operation that had gone far beyond simple gambling debts. Detective Torres read through the journal with growing amazement. According to Mark's own words, he hadn't just been gambling and losing money. He'd been recruited by a crime organization to help them move money through fake college expenses and scholarship funds. Mark had been using his status as a popular high school athlete to recruit other students into the scheme. But the journal revealed that Mark had gotten greedy. He'd been skimming money from the operation, thinking no one would notice. By the spring of 1998, He owed the organization over $200,000, not the $50,000 that Detective Santos had originally estimated. The journal entries from the days leading up to prom painted a picture of a young man in complete panic. Mark knew his handlers were closing in on him. He'd been planning to confess everything to his parents after prom and beg them to help him disappear. But the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Among the documents was a series of letters written by someone identified only as S. The handwriting analysis would later confirm that these letters had been written by Sarah Mitchell, but they were dated months after the disappearance. The letters told an incredible story. According to Sarah's own words, the 4 teenagers hadn't been killed on prom night. They'd been taken to a compound in rural West Virginia, where they'd been held as insurance against Mark's debt. "They keep telling us that as long as Mark cooperates, we'll be safe," one letter read. "Mark has to do jobs for them now, things he won't talk about. David tries to keep our spirits up, but we're all scared. Jessica cries every night. I keep thinking about my parents and wondering if they think we're dead." The letters painted a picture of teenagers trying to survive in an impossible situation. They were kept in a converted barn on a property that seemed to be in the middle of nowhere. Mark was taken away periodically to participate in criminal activities, while the other 3 remained as hostages. Sarah's letters described the psychological torture of their situation. They were given just enough freedom to hope they might escape, but never enough to actually try. Their captors played mind games, sometimes treating them almost kindly, other times threatening them with violence if they didn't cooperate. "Mark blames himself for everything," Sarah wrote in one letter. "He keeps apologizing, but sorry doesn't change anything. David told him that we're all in this together now, but I can see the anger in his eyes sometimes. Jessica won't even look at Mark anymore." The final letter in the collection was dated almost 2 years after the disappearance. Sarah's handwriting had changed, becoming shakier and more erratic. "I don't think we're ever going home," she wrote. "Mark tried to escape last week, and they brought him back badly beaten. They said if anyone tries to leave again, they'll kill all of us. David and I have been talking about what our lives might have been like if this never happened. We would have graduated, gone to college, maybe gotten married someday. Now I don't even remember what normal feels like." Detective Torres called in federal agents as soon as he realized the scope of what they'd discovered. The case was no longer just a missing persons investigation. It was now connected to a major organized crime operation that had been active for over a decade. The FBI traced the documents and belongings back to the crime family that had been mentioned in Mark's journal. Several arrests were made, including 3 men who had been photographed with Mark in the weeks before prom. But when federal agents raided the West Virginia compound described in Sarah's letters, they found it abandoned. The property had been sold years earlier, and the new owners had torn down all the old buildings and built a modern house. The trail had gone cold again, but this time they had evidence that the 4 teenagers had survived for at least 2 years after their disappearance. The question now was what had happened to them after that final letter from Sarah. The discovery of the buried container had reopened wounds that had never fully healed, but it had also given the families something they hadn't had in 12 years. Hope. If Sarah, David, Jessica, and Mark had survived for 2 years after their disappearance, maybe they were still alive somewhere. FBI agent Patricia Reynolds was assigned to lead the federal investigation. She was a specialist in organized crime cases and had spent most of her career tracking the activities of East Coast crime families. The documents found in the container gave her more insight into one particular organization than she'd gathered in 5 years of surveillance. "This is bigger than just 4 missing kids," Agent Reynolds explained to the families during a meeting at the Millbrook Police Department. "Your children stumbled into the middle of a major money laundering operation. The people who took them weren't just collecting a debt. They were protecting a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise." Linda Mitchell listened with a mixture of hope and horror. But Sarah's letters show they were alive in 2000. That's only 10 years ago. They could still be out there. Agent Reynolds nodded carefully. "That's what we're hoping to find out. But I need you all to understand that this investigation could take years, and we may never find all the answers you're looking for." The FBI's investigation focused on Vincent "Vinny" Marcello, the crime boss whose organization had recruited Mark Thompson. Marcello ran his operations out of South Philadelphia, but his influence extended throughout Pennsylvania and into neighboring states. The money laundering scheme involving college students had been just one part of his empire. Federal agents had been trying to build a case against Marcello for years, but he was careful and smart, insulating himself from direct involvement in criminal activities. The documents found with the teenager's belongings were the first hard evidence connecting him to specific crimes. Agent Reynolds and her team began working backwards from 2000, trying to trace what had happened to the compound in West Virginia where the teenagers had been held. Property records showed that the land had been owned by a shell company connected to Marcello's organization until 2004, when it was sold to a legitimate development company. Neighbors in the area remembered the compound, though they'd had no idea what was happening there. Margaret Foster, who lived about 2 miles away, recalled seeing young people working around the property during the day. "I thought they were maybe troubled kids in some kind of work program," she told Agent Reynolds. "They were always doing manual labor, building fences, clearing brush. Sometimes I'd see them walking along the road, but they never waved or acknowledged anyone." Looking back, that seems strange for teenagers. This was the first confirmation that the 4 missing teenagers had indeed been at the West Virginia location, and that they'd been forced to work for their captors. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Agent Reynolds received a call from the U.S. Marshals Service. They had arrested a man named Anthony Ricci in connection with an unrelated fraud case, and during questioning, he'd mentioned knowing something about missing teenagers from Pennsylvania. Ricci was a low-level criminal who had worked for various crime families over the years doing whatever jobs needed doing. He wasn't particularly smart or loyal, which made him exactly the kind of person who might talk to law enforcement in exchange for a reduced sentence. "I drove some kids from Pennsylvania down to West Virginia back in '98, Ricci told Agent Reynolds during their first interview. "Boss said they were going to work off a debt. Didn't seem like a big deal at the time." Agent Reynolds tried to keep her excitement from showing. "Can you describe these kids?" 2 guys, 2 girls. One of the guys was Hispanic, the other was white and kind of stocky. One girl was Asian, real pretty. The other was white with dark hair. They were all dressed up fancy, like they'd been to a dance or something. The description matched perfectly. Agent Reynolds had found the man who had transported Sarah, David, Jessica, and Mark from Millbrook to their prison in West Virginia. Over several interviews, Ricci revealed more details about the operation. The teenagers had been held at the compound for over 3 years, not just 2 as the letters had indicated. Mark had been forced to participate in increasingly serious criminal activities, while the other 3 had been used as manual labor and as leverage to ensure Mark's cooperation. The Hispanic kid, David, he was always trying to keep the others' spirits up, Ricci remembered. Real leader type. The stocky guy, Mark, he was a mess most of the time. Crying, apologizing, trying to make deals. The girls stuck together mostly. Agent away, Reynolds asked the question that all the families were desperate to know the answer to. What happened to them? Are they still alive? Ricci looked uncomfortable. I stopped working that detail in 2001, but I heard things. Boss was getting tired of keeping them around. They were a liability, especially as they got older and stronger, harder to control. The agent pressed him for more specific information, but Ricci claimed he didn't know what the final decision had been regarding the 4 hostages. Meanwhile, the families were struggling to process this new information. Knowing that their children had been alive for at least 3 years after the disappearance was both comforting and devastating. It meant they'd missed years of their children's lives, but it also meant there was still a chance they could be found. Carmen Rodriguez had the hardest time with the revelations about what David had endured. My son was trying to take care of everyone else while going through his own hell, she said through tears. That's exactly what David would do. He always looked out for others. The investigation expanded to include other crime families that had connections to Marcello's organization. Agent Reynolds discovered that the compound in West Virginia had been part of a larger network of properties used for various criminal activities. Some were used for drug manufacturing, others for money laundering operations, and some, like the one where the teenagers had been held, served as detention facilities for people who had become problems for the organization. A breakthrough came when agents raided another property in rural Virginia, based on information provided by Ricci. They didn't find the missing teenagers, but they did find evidence that multiple people had been held there over the years. More importantly, they found a ledger that listed names, dates, and what appeared to be disposal methods for various problems the organization had dealt with. The ledger contained entries for Pennsylvania package, with dates ranging from May 1998 through March 2002. The final entry was ominous. Package relocated to permanent storage. Agent Reynolds knew that permanent storage was criminal slang for murder, but she couldn't bring herself to share that information with the families. Yet, she needed to find more concrete evidence before destroying their renewed hope. The federal investigation was making progress in building a case against Vincenzo Marcello and his organization, but it wasn't bringing them any closer to finding the 4 missing teenagers. After months of following leads and interviewing criminals, Agent Reynolds was beginning to fear that Sarah, David, Jessica, and Mark had met the same fate as many other people who had become inconvenient to organized crime families. But then she received a phone call that would change everything. A woman identifying herself as a former FBI informant said she had information about 4 teenagers who had been held by Marcello's organization. She was willing to talk, but only if the FBI could guarantee her protection and a new identity. "I know what happened to those kids from Pennsylvania," the woman said. "And if you want to find them, you need to stop looking in all the wrong places." The woman, who called herself Maria Santos, had been living under an assumed name in Oregon for the past 8 years. She'd been Vincent Marcello's bookkeeper from 1995 to 2002, handling the financial records for his various criminal enterprises. When she'd finally decided to cooperate with federal authorities in exchange for witness protection, she'd taken copies of documents that could bring down the entire organization. Agent Reynolds flew to Oregon to meet with Maria in a secure FBI facility. The woman was nervous, constantly looking over her shoulder despite being in protective custody. She'd aged significantly since the photograph in her FBI file, her dark hair now streaked with gray, and her face lined with stress. "I've been waiting 12 years for someone to ask me about those kids, Indy," Maria said as she sat across from Agent Reynolds in a sterile conference room. "What Vinny did to them, it haunted me. It's why I finally decided to turn on the organization." Maria explained that she'd been present during many of the discussions about what to do with the 4 teenagers. Initially, they'd been seen as simple collateral against Mark Thompson's debt. But as Mark became more valuable to the organization as a recruiter and money mule, keeping his friends became a long-term strategy. Vinny realized that Mark would do anything to keep the others safe, Maria continued. So instead of killing them after Mark paid off his debt, he decided to keep them as permanent leverage. Mark became one of his most effective operators because he knew that any mistake could cost his friends their lives. Agent Reynolds took careful notes as Maria described the setup. The 4 teenagers had been moved multiple times over the years, never staying in one location for more than 6 months. This explained why the FBI had been unable to track them down using the West Virginia compound as a starting point. By 2001, they weren't really prisoners anymore, Maria revealed. They were more like indentured servants. Vinny had convinced them that their families thought they were dead, and that the only way to stay alive was to work for the organization and keep quiet. This information was devastating but also hopeful. If the teenagers had been alive and working for the organization as late as 2002, there was still a chance they could be found. What kinds of work were they doing? Agent Reynolds asked. Maria pulled out a folder of documents she'd kept hidden for nearly a decade. Sarah was smart with numbers, so she helped me with bookkeeping. Jessica had medical training from high school, so she became our unofficial medic for when people got hurt and couldn't go to a hospital. David was strong and reliable, so he did security work. And Mark, well, Mark was our best recruiter. He could convince college kids to get involved in schemes they never would have considered otherwise. The agent stared at the documents Maria had provided. They included payroll records showing payments to people using aliases, but she recognized the birth dates. Sarah Mitchell was listed as Sandra Martin, David Rodriguez as Diego Rivera, Jessica Chen as Jennifer Chang, and Mark Thompson as Michael Taylor. According to the records, all four had been receiving regular payments through 2002, confirming that they'd been alive much longer than the letters had indicated. What happened in 2002? Agent Reynolds asked, though she dreaded the answer. Maria's expression darkened. That's when everything changed. The FBI was getting close to Vinny's operation, and he decided he needed to eliminate any witnesses who could testify against him. There was talk about disposing of anyone who knew too much about the organization's activities. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. Agent Reynolds had to ask the question the families were desperate to know the answer to, even though she suspected she wouldn't like what she heard. Are they dead? Maria shook her head slowly. I don't know. That's the honest truth. In March 2002, Vinny told me to stop making payments to the four aliases. He said they were being relocated permanently. But I never saw death certificates or disposal records like there were for other people who were eliminated. This was the first real hope Agent Reynolds had been given in months of investigation. If there were no death records, maybe the teenagers had been moved somewhere else rather than killed. I think Vinny might have sold them, Maria continued. There were other crime families who used forced labor for various operations. It's possible he transferred them to settle debts or as part of business deals. Agent Reynolds knew that human trafficking was a major component of organized crime, but the idea that four teenagers from a small Pennsylvania town could have been traded like commodities was almost too horrible to comprehend. Do you have any idea who they might have been transferred to? The agent asked. Maria nodded grimly. Vinny had business relationships with families in Florida, Nevada, and California. He also had connections to operations in Mexico. Any of them could have taken the four kids as payment for debts or as part of larger deals. The investigation suddenly became much more complex. Instead of looking for four people who might be dead, Agent Reynolds was now searching for four people who could be anywhere in North America, possibly living under completely different identities, and possibly not even aware that anyone was looking for them. Maria provided additional documents that showed financial transactions between Marcello's organization and criminal groups in other states. In March 2002, there had been a large transfer of assets to a group operating out of Las Vegas, including what was described as four specialized workers. The Las Vegas connection makes sense, Maria explained. They needed people who could blend in, who looked legitimate. College-aged kids from good families would be perfect for certain types of operations in Nevada. Agent Reynolds contacted the FBI field office in Las Vegas and requested assistance in tracking down the organization that had received the transfer from Marcello. What they discovered was both encouraging and frustrating. The Las Vegas group had been dismantled by federal agents in 2005, 3 years after the transfer. Most of the leadership had been arrested or killed in the takedown, and the lower-level operatives had scattered across the country. But the operation had been large enough that finding four specific individuals among the hundreds of people who had worked for the organization would be extremely difficult. However, the FBI had seized extensive records during the 2005 raid, and these were still stored in evidence warehouses. Agent Reynolds requested that these records be searched for any mention of the four specialized workers who had been transferred from Pennsylvania. While waiting for the search results, Agent Reynolds made the difficult decision to update the families on what had been discovered. She flew back to Pennsylvania and arranged to meet with all four families together. The conference room at the Millbrook Police Department had never felt smaller as Agent Reynolds faced the parents who had been waiting 12 years for answers about their missing children. I want to start by saying that we have reason to believe your children were alive much longer than we initially thought, she began. According to our source, they were working for Marcello's organization through at least 2002, possibly longer. Linda. Mitchell gripped her husband's hand tightly. Working for them? What does that mean? Agent Reynolds explained as gently as possible what Maria had told her about the teenagers' roles within the criminal organization. The parents listened in stunned silence as they learned that their children had been forced to become part of the very system that had destroyed their lives. Sarah was helping with financial records. Agent Reynolds continued. David was doing security work. Jessica was providing medical assistance. And Mark was recruiting other young people. Carmen Rodriguez spoke up, her voice shaking with anger. You're telling me that my son spent years helping these criminals hurt other families? I'm telling you that your son did whatever he had to keep himself and his friends alive, Agent Reynolds replied firmly. According to our source, Mark was completely devoted to protecting the other three. Everything he did was motivated by love for his friends. The revelation that the teenagers might have been transferred to other criminal organizations was both hopeful and terrifying. It meant they could still be alive, but it also meant they could be anywhere, living lives that were completely unrecognizable from the futures they'd planned as high school seniors. 3 weeks later, Agent Reynolds received the call she'd been hoping for. The search of the Las Vegas evidence had yielded results. Among the thousands of documents seized in 2005 were employment records for 4 people whose descriptions and ages matched the missing teenagers from Pennsylvania. According to the Las Vegas records, Sandra Martin, Diego Rivera, Jennifer Chang, and Michael Taylor had worked for the organization from 2002 through 2004. But unlike their time with Marcello's group, they appeared to have had more freedom in Las Vegas. The records showed they'd been living in legitimate housing and receiving regular paychecks. Most importantly, there were records indicating that in 2004, all 4 had been released from their obligations to the organization. They'd been given new identification documents and small amounts of money, and they'd been told they were free to start new lives wherever they chose. For the first time in 12 years, Agent Reynolds had concrete evidence that Sarah Mitchell, David Rodriguez, Jessica Chen, and Mark Thompson might not only be alive, but might be living as free PO. Agent Reynolds faced a challenge unlike any she'd encountered in her career. How do you find 4 people who had been given new identities and told to disappear? People who might be afraid to reveal themselves, even if they knew someone was looking for them. People who might not trust law enforcement after years of being told that their families thought they were dead. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. Emily Watson, a trauma counselor who worked with survivors of human trafficking, contacted the FBI after seeing news coverage of the case. She had been providing therapy to a woman who had mentioned details that seemed to match the missing teenager's story. I can't reveal her identity due to patient confidentiality, Dr. Watson explained to Agent Reynolds, but I can tell you that she's been carrying tremendous guilt about 3 friends she believes died because of choices she made. She's mentioned specific details about being held captive starting when she was 18, and about being forced to work for criminal organizations. Agent Reynolds was cautious but hopeful. Can you ask her if she'd be willing to speak with federal agents? We could arrange for her protection and complete confidentiality. Dr. Watson agreed to approach her, patient carefully. 2 days later, she called back with news that made Agent Reynolds' heart race. She wants to meet with you, Dr. Watson said. But she has conditions. She wants to bring 2 friends with her, and she wants the meeting to take place somewhere she feels safe. The meeting was arranged for the following week at a community center in Phoenix, Arizona. Agent Reynolds flew to Arizona with her heart pounding, carrying photographs of the 4 missing teenagers and hoping against hope that she was about to reunite 4 families with their children. When Agent Reynolds walked into the community center conference room, she saw 3 people sitting nervously at a table. Even after 12 years, she recognized them immediately. Sarah Mitchell, now 30 years old, had grown into a beautiful woman, though her eyes carried a wariness that hadn't been there in her high school photos. David Rodriguez had filled out and grown a beard, but his kind eyes were unmistakable. Jessica Chen looked remarkably similar to her teenage self, though she seemed more confident and self-assured than the shy girl in the prom photos. "Where's Mark?" Agent Reynolds asked gently. The 3 friends exchanged glances and Sarah spoke for the group. "Mark died in 2006, she said quietly. Cancer. He never got proper medical treatment during the years we were held, and by the time he was diagnosed, it was too late." Agent Reynolds felt her heart sink, knowing that she would have to deliver this devastating news to the Thompson family. But she also felt overwhelming relief at seeing the other 3 alive and apparently healthy. "We know why you're here," David said. "We've been following the news about the investigation. We've been waiting 12 years to decide whether we could trust anyone enough to come forward." Over the next several hours, the three survivors told Agent Reynolds their complete story. It was even more harrowing than anything the investigation had uncovered. After being released by the Las Vegas organization in 2004, they had been given false identification documents and a small amount of money, but they had been warned that returning to their families or contacting law enforcement would result in death for both them and their loved ones. We were told that our families had moved on, that they thought we were dead, and that showing up would only bring danger to everyone, Jessica explained. We were convinced that the only way to keep our parents safe was to stay hidden. The four friends had stayed together, supporting each other as they tried to build new lives. They had worked low-paying jobs that didn't require extensive background checks, always moving frequently, and never staying in one place long enough to form meaningful relationships with other people. Mark's illness had devastated the group. Without access to proper health care due to their false identities, they had watched helplessly as he grew sicker. Sarah had held his hand when he died in a charity hospital in New Mexico, using the name Michael Taylor that had been forced on him 8 years earlier. He never stopped blaming himself for what happened to us, Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. Even at the end, he kept apologizing. We told him over and over that we forgave him, that we didn't blame him, but he never forgave himself. After Mark's death, the three survivors had moved to Phoenix, where they had finally begun to establish more stable lives. Sarah had enrolled in community college under her false name and was studying accounting. David was working as a construction supervisor. Jessica had become a certified medical assistant and was working at a clinic that served undocumented immigrants. We found ways to help other people who were living in the shadows, David explained. It made us feel like maybe some good could come out of what we'd been through. Agent Reynolds asked the question she knew the families were desperate to hear. The answer to, "Do you want to go home?" The three friends looked at each other, having clearly discussed this possibility many times over the years. "We want to see our families," Sarah said, "but we're scared. We're not the same people who disappeared on prom night. We've done things, seen things that we can never tell our parents about. We don't know if we can go back to being their children. And we're still afraid," Jessica added. "Some of the people who held us are still out there. What if coming forward puts our families in danger?" Agent Reynolds assured them that the FBI would provide protection and help them safely reunite with their families. She also explained that several members of Marcello's organization had been arrested, significantly reducing the threat to their safety. The reunion took place 2 weeks later at a secure FBI facility in Philadelphia. Agent Reynolds had prepared the families as much as possible, but nothing could have truly prepared them for the moment when they saw their children again after 12 years. Linda Mitchell collapsed into her daughter's arms, sobbing uncontrollably. "I never stopped believing you were alive," she whispered. "I never stopped waiting for you to come home." Carmen Rodriguez held David so tightly that Agent Reynolds worried she might hurt him. "My boy," she kept repeating. "My beautiful boy." Jessica's parents flew in from California, where they had moved 5 years earlier, unable to bear living in the house where they had waited for news that never came. The hardest part was telling the Thompson family about Mark's death. Robert and Helen Thompson had held on to hope for 12 years, and learning that their son had died alone in a hospital, far from home and using a name that wasn't his own, was devastating. But Sarah, David, and Jessica were able to tell them about Mark's final years, about how he had never stopped loving them and missing them, about how he had protected his friends even when it meant putting himself in danger. "He saved us," Sarah told Mark's parents. "Over and over again, he put himself between us and danger. He became a good man despite everything that happened to him." The three survivors faced long journeys of healing and adjustment. They required extensive therapy to deal with the trauma of their captivity and the guilt of surviving when Mark hadn't. They had to learn how to trust people again, how to form relationships that weren't based on shared trauma, how to build futures they had stopped believing were possible, but they were home. After 12 years of being lost, Sarah Mitchell, David Rodriguez, and Jessica Chen had found their way back to the people who had never stopped loving them and never stopped looking for them. The case that had haunted Millbrook for over a decade was finally closed, though the scars it left would never fully heal. The town learned to celebrate the return of 3 of their own while mourning the loss of the 4th. And somewhere in a small cemetery in New Mexico, a gravestone marked Michael Taylor stands as a testament to a young man who made terrible choices but spent the rest of his short life trying to make amends, protecting the friends he loved until his final breath.